Hi, Bill.
Hi there, Conn. How you doing?
Doing well. We're here for another edition of This Week in Blog, the last one of 2008. Very exciting.
You had a good holiday?
I did. I did nothing. Stayed home with the wife and kid.
I think that's the answer to the question, what would Jesus do? It's nothing.
Well, when people ask me what I want to do on my birthday, I always say nothing.
Excellent. Well, we haven't had a This Week in Blog in 2 weeks.
Well, I did one the week before with
Sarah.
Sarah, right, out in Vancouver.
We took last week off.
Right.
So much has percolated since then. Should we start off with
Israel? Why not?
What's that?
Gaza.
Well, I mean, I'm sure there'll be other folks on Blogging Heads who are more foreign policy experts than you or I. So let's maybe try not to get too deep in the arguments. But I thought that Jane Hampshire at Fire Dog Lake had a particularly notable post as far as what we generally talk about is how the blogosphere is impacting national discourse. And it was about how on the left that there is much more open debate and blogging around Mideast politics when a lot of folks were somewhat self-censoring themselves over the last few years and not wanting to wade into these treacherous waters. And Jane credits that to three things. One, the rise of J Street, which is a new Jewish political action group to be a progressive counterweight to AIPAC. I think there are a lot of liberal progressive Jews that have been frustrated that AIPAC has been seen as the sole voice of the Jewish community when there is a diversity of opinion in the Jewish community, like any community. And they've definitely changed the dynamic. Two, she actually credits Joe Klein, which I know, Conn, you treat Joe Klein like every other liberal, but in the liberal blogosphere, Joe Klein has long been seen as an enemy. And Jane says the importance of what Joe Klein... I'm well aware. I'm sorry?
I'm well aware.
The importance of what Joe Klein did in the face of intimidation tactics from the extreme right cannot be overstated when Jennifer Rubin of Commentary Magazine called Klein an anti-Semite for criticizing Israel. And the ADL piled on and condemned him. It was pretty much just standard operating procedure for them. Tactics had silenced many critics before, but Klein was totally and appropriately enraged with this kind of thuggery and fought back publicly on the pages of Time. And then three, she generally says leadership. What Klein did to Commentary Magazine and the ADL, Glenn Greenwald has done to Marty Peretz, and the neocon propaganda organ he runs the New Republic. Likewise, Ezra Klein, Matt Iglesias, Spencer Ackerman, Paul Rosenberg, Sion, Ian Welsh, and Sully Newberry have done a tremendous job of stepping outside the usual suspect sources and taking advantage of a new freedom to explore the subject of Israel from a multiplicity of viewpoints. And I could add, all sorts of blogs beyond that. Gershon Gorenberg, who has been on Blogging Heads before and really wrote, I'm not that I'm an authority on the subject, but I thought The Accidental Empire was an absolutely must-read book on the history of the conflict. He blogs at southjerusalem.com now. Pat Lang, who blogs at Six Separate Tyrannus, does interesting stuff too. Juan Cole's side blog, the Informed Comment group blog, has great stuff there. MJ Rosenberg at TPM Cafe. So there's really a lot of stuff going on out there, and I could go on as far as why. I think there's more reasons than what Jane enumerates, though I agree with what Jane says. I think there's more reasons why, but it's nice to be able to have these discussions, enough for just the sake of having a nice conversation. Of course, it's very serious, plight that we're looking at. But I think we're going to get better policies because we can have a more freer discussion without getting hysterical smears in response to people expressing their viewpoints.
Yeah, I guess I don't have the numbers to back me up on this, but just from my own very thorough reading of the lethosphere from when I was paid to do just that, I don't notice any particular uptick, except for the fact there are just more outlets for people to blog at. I mean, I don't remember, Juan Cole or Matthew Iglesias or Spencer Ackerman ever being particularly shy about sharing their honest views on Israel. There are definitely more all the ones you mentioned, more outlets for people to blog their opinion at.
I think it's in part that, I think for the most part, the people you name, I'd say that's correct. It's more that what they're blogging about is reverberating more and more bloggers are reacting to it and discussing it openly, and they're not just sort of blogging on the margins of the blogosphere and not becoming part of the larger conversation. I know myself. I publicly said at one point in my early blogging, when I started blogging in 2002, was right in the middle of a Middle East flashpoint. I blogged about it for several days, and I got to a point after a year where I said, "Forget it. There's no constructive dialogue to be had here. So what's the point of blogging about it? I'm getting a lot of angry email, and I'm not pushing this conversation forward. So I washed my hands of it for the time being. I ended up coming back to it several years later. I know that there are a lot of individual Air America hosts. There's no decree by Air America, of course, not to talk about it. But I think Randy Rhoads at one point said, "Look, I just want to talk about this. I just get just burns up the phones and a lot of yelling and screaming. And what do you get out of it?" So it's been a difficult subject on the left because there is a range of viewpoint on the left about it. Jimmy Carter got his hat handed to him in many respects when he put out Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. But I think that's also a development that's worth pointing to here, something that's pushed the dialogue along, even though he got a firestorm of criticism after it. So I think the dynamic on the left is very different now than it was 4 years ago, and hopefully there'll actually be some substantive benefits from that.
Talk about moving the dialogue forward. What do you imagine the substantive policy changes being?
Well, M.J. Rosenberg made an interesting observation on TPM Cafe that, on one sense you can say, Obama's stated remarks throughout the campaign and now are not all that different than Bush's. He doesn't want to negotiate with Hamas. Israel's a steadfast ally, special relationship. But there was a tonal difference between what David Axelrod did on Meet the Press this Sunday than what the Bush administration did. Whereas the Bush administration was,
Oh, you mean David Axelrod, the guy who has sworn to us he's not going to be like Karl Rove and not going to affect policy in any way?
Well, I don't know if he shaped the policy, but he was on Meet the Press as a spokesperson of the administration, of the incoming administration. When the White House did a very standard condemnation of Hamas for their role in the conflict, Axelrod emphasized a special relationship with Israel, but he didn't go out of his way to do the blanket condemnation of Hamas in that appearance. And Rosenberg took that as an example of the incoming Obama administration looking to be more of an honest broker and not just simply paint this as a very black and white, good guy, bad guy situation, recognizing that there is fault on both sides here, not being afraid of having conservatives attack them for being more relativist and all that. It could just be, symbolism with no substance behind it. The policy is very soon going to be much more important than the rhetoric. But it was an indication that perhaps they feel a little bit more comfortable taking a more subtle approach here, and hopefully that'll give them more credibility in the region to actually find some common ground, tamp down conflict, and actually be able to have a working environment for substantive peace negotiations.
Yeah, I guess I would just point to a Jeffrey Goldberg post over at The Atlantic. He writes, if someone was sending rockets on my house where my daughter is sleeping tonight, I would do everything to stop it, and I would expect Israelis to do the same thing. Those aren't my words, they're Barack Obama's, but I attach myself to this sentiment. Obama said this in July after visiting the southern Israeli town of Sderot. Visits to Sderot will do that for you. Make you see things clearly. For what it works, this is how I see what's happening in Gaza. And he goes on. No country in the world would afford to ignore such attacks, and no country would. An elected government such as this has a basic overriding responsibility to protect its citizens from the organized violence of its enemies. So, we'll see, what Obama's actual policy, is when he gets in the office to change it. But, I wouldn't expect the news to be that much different 4 years from now or 8 years from now. But we'll see.
It'd be hard to predict otherwise based on the track record of the region. And I certainly don't think Obama is all of a sudden going to negotiate directly with Hamas when he said so clearly that he would not. But let's keep in mind, Israel negotiates with Hamas. They've had a ceasefire for 6 months, but based on their negotiations, and they're more than willing to negotiate again. And if an Obama administration is looking to lean on Israel more than the Bush administration did to push for some working compromises, when factions of Hamas, as they did when they first came into elective office after elections, put out some feelers and made some olive branches, you might have an Obama administration being more receptive to that and take some steps to give those olive branches some credibility and not have them be swatted down. So I see the opportunity for a very different Middle East in a 4-year period, but it would be crazy for anybody to get overly optimistic and assume it's all going to transform right away because these problems have been so intractable for so long.
Well, I will predict that the first 6 months, Obama's going to fly to Jakarta, that being the capital of the Muslim nation he's going to speak to, and we'll see what he says about the situation then. But
I guess there's talk between Jakarta and Cairo.
What's your money on?
Maybe now, maybe not Cairo.
My money was always on Jakarta.
Egypt's a little bit too close to all this. I could see Turkey being a possibility also.
Yeah, but you don't have the homecoming angle.
But some people argue that the homecoming angle somewhat undermines it. It makes it a little less dramatic that he's taking a trip to where he was a kid for a time, as opposed to going for a place that's a little bit more seen as the heart of the Arab world.
We'll find out. But in the meantime, just to go back to some nice, good old-fashioned blogger sniping. David Bernstein and Glenn Greenwald had a great little back and forth, and I'll just read Bernstein's last entry in it, just because I can. Bernstein writes, still waiting for Glenn Greenwald to tell us what would be a proportionate Israeli response to the launching of hundreds of missiles at its civilian population from Hamas-controlled Gaza, as opposed to what he calls Israel's currently massively disproportionate response. In other Greenwald news, just to keep track of who is engaging in what Greenwald calls juvenile and emotional manipulative means of argumentation, Greenwald implicitly acknowledges, as I noted yesterday, that he blogs far more about Israel than I do. But, according to Greenwald, when he blogs constantly about Israel, it's because he's a clear-eyed realist above the implications of Israeli actions of American foreign policy. When I do it less often, it's because I'm an Israeli obsessive. Glad that's cleared up. So anyways, Bernstein was my old con law professor, so anytime he scores points on Glenn's part, it's good for me.
Well, I'm not sure I look at that post as an example of the discourse being all that helpful and constructive.
No. I mean, of all the posts you cited before, I don't think any of the new stuff is that much more constructive than it has been in the past.
Are you accusing your old professor of not being constructive?
I'm making the same accusation of Glenn.
Well, perhaps we should move on to. Do you want to go stimulus or everyone's favorite Barack Obama parody song?
I think the parody might be the bigger, more fresher issue. So we can do that first if you want.
I gotta say, I think this is a very. I mean, the flop of itself is sort of small, but how the various strands of the conservative movement are handling it, I find extremely interesting as far as a part of their regrouping process and deciding how to go from here, how to regain credibility, expand their base, etc. My take from what conservative blogs I was reading was a general support for Chip Saltzman, former Tennessee GOP chair, who sent out a CD as a gift to RNC members.
I don't know where on earth you get that from.
I'm more happy to be corrected.
And Politico ran that headline. What was it? Obama CD to help Saltzman, and you read through the article, and no one says that.
I mean, I read posts from Rick Moran, Right Wing Nut House, Michelle Malkin,
right,
Newsbusters, Real World View, Powerline. All those guys were, to some degree, supportive of Saltzman sending out this parody song as part of the CD.
I don't think you read Michelle's post correctly enough. I think what Michelle said was that everyone's overreacting to this, but that it was still unwise of Chip to do it. And it's the same thing that you saw in the Politico.
Well, I said degree.
Right.
There's a degree of support that expands.
I wouldn't call that support. I mean, it's not like everyone's like, yes, Chip, this was a great idea. Everyone should try to, do stuff like this in their campaigns. It was more like,
are there any conservative bloggers that are saying this is a inherently racist parody and it's disgusting and it should have any part to do with the conservative movement whatsoever? Is anybody saying that?
I don't think anyone's coming out and calling Chip a racist. It's more of...
not that Chip's a racist, but the song is a racist song. The Al Sharpton impersonation is inherently racist. And we don't want anything remotely like that being associated with the conservative movement. Is there anybody making that argument?
No. I mean, I'm sure there is somewhere, but, I think the more general accusation is, this is just a dumb move by Chip. Let me read a post by Owl Pundit at Hot Air that I think is more kind of representative of the conservative blogging community here. Tapper, as in Jake Tapper, reminds us of the song's genesis in a lefty LA Times op-ed about conventions of authenticity, which lyrics the parody and the one's good humor in laughing it off when you asked about it last year. I don't mind folks poking fun at me, Obama said. Which leaves us with this tediously predictable debate. If the song's not clearly racist, should Chip Saltzman be scolded for circulating it? Some righties say yes, since we know that the media will do what the media will do with it and how it will affect voter perceptions of the GOP. Others say no, that they'll be damned before they let the left set their parameters of what's politically correct. Count me in the former group, with Garrity and John Avlon. There are perhaps principles so important that it's worth risking the party's viability to defend them. Strong borders and into bailout mania, but the use of archaic terms like Negro that's disfavored by blacks doesn't strike me as one of them. If you disagree and think the real principle here is resisting to ever-expanding Orwellian universe of unacceptable terms, fair enough. But be prepared to divert party resources from other business to try to convince blacks that they shouldn't feel uneasy about words that cause them unease.
I mean, what I find so striking about these, it's a rationalization for defending the parody itself. Mm-hmm. Separate from Chip Saltzman's political acumen sending it around. And when you look at the song is not making fun of Barack. For Barack Obama to say, I don't mind when people make fun of me, that's sort of like a fine political thing for him to say. But to listen to the song, Barack Obama's not the butt of the joke. The butt of the joke is white liberals for having superficial reasons for supporting Barack.
Yeah.
And Al Sharpton for being the sort of buffoonish race hustler.
Yeah.
And
seems to be the position of the New York Times.
I'm sorry?
I said the fact that Al Sharpton is a buffoonish race hustler seems to be the position of the New York Times.
Well, there are substantive criticisms to make about Al Sharpton.
Right.
There are substantive criticisms to make about
white
liberals who have silly reasons for their actions sometimes. But the Al Sharpton impersonation, which is extremely charitable to call it that, is a minstrel show. That's what's racially offensive here. And you play 5 seconds of the song on the radio or TV, and that is evident to anybody listening to it. So to see conservative bloggers, go through all these contortions to justify the song, I think on its face. So
to recap, you're okay with making fun of Al Sharpton as a race hustler and white liberal guilt, but you just want it to be done well.
Will be done in a non-racist way. Satire's fine. Making fun of people's political stances is fine. But to caricature a race of people is one of the tenets of racism.
Well, I guess, some people will say the Al Sharpton voice is characterizing an entire race. Other people will just say it's characterizing Al Sharpton.
Well, everyone always makes excuses for things. Field Negro, African-American blogger, says, I always wonder what the black folks in the RNC camp are thinking. Do they think it's funny? Are they embarrassed? Do they pick up the phone, call their comrades in arms and say, hey, man, you are killing me here? Do they tell their Republican pals they're making it way too easy for certain bloggers of color and black folks to label the party as insensitive? A Surer at Tapped says, there's never been a funnier parody, Eric Erickson at Red State says. This guy doesn't even get the joke. Has no idea of the cultural forces that produce the widely used term that he attributes to a columnist whose column he hasn't read. The intended audience is itself too dense and too ignorant to even come close of getting David Ehrenstein's point, the person who actually wrote the original column that the song's based on. Like good little ditto bots, they defend the song as parody. They just can't tell you what it means. The defense of the song amount to complaints that everyone else is too dumb to get the brilliance of the satire that is beyond their capacity to explain, which forces one to ask the question, if they don't get the joke, what exactly do they think is so damn funny? What perplexes me here is I think almost everyone at the party realizes, everyone at the conservative movement realizes that they're not going to, this is the Karl Rove argument, we are not going to sustain as an all-white entity. There are things that we need to do to expand our reach and make our arguments heard by different groups of people. And then to go through these wild machinations to explain what is obviously racist. I mean, you have to listen to The Voice for 5 seconds, and it's a clearly racist, stereotypical minstrel show thing to do.
Yeah, I just think it's just not that funny of a parody. I guess I'm at a disadvantage here. But at the same time, I don't think it's racist. I do think it is, has definitely opportunity to offend people.
You think that is an excellent, spot-on impersonation of Al Sharpton, and not at all related to a two-dimensional caricature of what an average urban black person talks like.
I absolutely love Jon Stewart's two-dimensional impersonation of Bush. I laugh at it every time. I think it's hilarious. I tune in most nights just to watch that impersonation. I didn't find the Sharpton one to be particularly funny, but I don't think that you have to have every impersonation be spot on in order to be within the bounds of debate.
I mean, there's bad impersonations, and there are impersonations that are relying on long-standing, disgusting, inaccurate stereotypes. The Daily Show explores race issues, so much that it's going to be very hard to tag The Daily Show as trying to do racist things. Rush Limbaugh.
Well, I don't think anyone would tag
that
Jon Stewart as being racist for caricaturing George Bush. I think what I'm trying to say is that, humor is always going to be in the eye of the beholder. This was funny to some people, offensive to others, and it's a matter of taste. And for Chip to go ahead and use that without knowing that some people might find this offensive and not find it funny, just signals a tone deafness, which I very heartily agree is a problem within the conservative movement and the Republican Party. And I was actually shaping up to be a Chip fan until the story first broke. But for me, just like Kate and Dawson's membership in a exclusive club down in South Carolina, you go on Red State, you'll still see posts defending Dawson's membership in that club. They'll explain that, if you go to the club, there are actually black people there. You walk by, Kate didn't know. And it's like, you guys just don't get it. It's the very fact that it was exclusive. Means it's a story for the press, and it's just issue over Caton's done. And it's the same with Chip in this story. It's just bad politics. It was questionable taste to begin with, and to go ahead and use it at a sensitive time was just foolish, and he'll pay the price.
Do you think that in the conservative blogosphere there is because my general sense of things was that younger conservatives are a little bit more appreciative of getting past the Dixiecrat mentality and having a wider tent. But at the same time, that kind of cuts against the sort of love of being politically incorrect.
It's a fine line to walk.
Yeah,
it is. You're right. And so you have to exercise extreme taste and caution when doing it. And Chip didn't, and he's going to pay the price.
Should we leave it there and move on to the economic recovery package?
Stimulus it is.
So, it seems like the conservative blogosphere is gathering their ammo because the timing of this, it seems to me, is Congress gets sworn in on January 6th.
Right.
Obama is inaugurated January 20th.
Right.
There is some hope that Congress can get an economic recovery plan passed and put on its desk on January 20th.
Hope, that's the plan.
The Obama team has started to tamp that down a little bit. They're worried about delaying tactics. They don't want to set the bar too high for themselves. But obviously they want to get it done as soon as possible. And you're starting to see in the conservative blogosphere some attempts of strategizing to. I guess I'm not even quite sure. I know what I think the conservative endgame is on this, but when I ask you, what do you think? Are they trying to kill it? Are they trying to reform it? What do you think they're trying to do here?
Well, I think there's a certain amount of fait accompli that there's no way you're going to completely kill it. So, I mean, it's great that you think we have an end game in mind. I don't think we do. Patrick Ruffini at the Next Right had a good post on the stimulus. He writes, first he cites a Brooks article on what David Brooks would like to see, and he says, in 2002 when Mark Warner tried to push through a tax increase referendum to pay for roads in Northern Virginia, he was thwarted by environmentalists and progressives. The outer suburbs, nominally more Republican, voted for the referendum. Alexandria and Arlington voted against it, with precinct-by-precinct returns tracking closely with proximity to metro stations. This means a huge chunk of Obama's natural consistency will be soft on the infrastructure-heavy stimulus, and to that extent, there are still voices within the fiscal sanity. There are still voices of fiscal sanity left in the Democratic Party that may balk at the price tag of as much as $675 to $775 billion over 2 years, which would be the largest, most dramatic dollar-per-dollar expansion of government in the national debt in American history. It would also be good to be on the side of good government for once. Brooks' embrace of central planning aside, he is right that there just isn't $1 trillion of shovel-ready work ready to go, which means a lot of haphazard, fly-by-night crap getting funded. The stories of waste, fraud, and abuse from these projects will be legion. We may not agree ideologically with all who may want the stimulus to be more carefully planned out to fund their pet projects, but from left, center, and right, there will be a unifying argument that the Obama stimulus is a big, hairy mess that just isn't fully baked. Ideally, this unfolds as follows. Republicans begin to tap into Americans' common sense belief in belt-tightening as the appropriate response to lean economic times. Families have to make sacrifices. It's time for the government to do the same and not saddle our kids with $1 trillion more in debt on top of bailout after bailout after bailout. Or taking on more debt than we could afford is what got us into this mess. Now they're saying that talking on more will get us out. Give me a break. We then introduce a $250 billion package of targeted tax cuts and small business incentives. We cite as a rationale for fearing Obama's. we cite as a rationale for the figure Obama's own economist, Christina Romer, who has found a times 3 multiplier effect from tax reduction, while other mainstream economists who say the multiplier from spending increase is only 1. We argue that this package would have the same impact as the inefficient and wasteful Obama stimulus. If they can be brazen and maximalist, so can we. Plus, it would be nice to hold fast to a position that doesn't concede spending hikes. If Obama looks like he's throwing money at the wall and undermining his own promise to build a green economy to boot, there is ample opportunity to reclaim the mantle of sane governance and fiscal responsibility, but only if we are serious about seizing it and not just another piece of the bailout action.
You know, there's part of that which I find wildly wishful thinking. I mean,
so do I.
There where he says, Democrats will hopefully delay the package as they figure out how to divvy up the spoils, which currently favor 91% male unionized construction workers over women and environmentalists. It's such a transparently cynical attempt to try to divide the Democratic coalition, which is not even going to happen because this package is going to be so large that you're not going to be stuck with having to do these sorts of trade-offs.
I agree. When the numbers keep going up and up, there's a lot less. There's a lot more pie to share. So I don't think you're going to have the environmentalists and the unions fighting over it because there's enough pork or go around to keep everyone happy.
And I was hard to know that Ruffini is very concerned about the concentration of males in the skilled trades. I'm sure he's done scores of blogging about opening up skilled labor to more women. And so I'm sure there's a lot of folks in the feminist community that would love to have Patrick Ruffini's help on that, now that he's shown his sensitivity to the subject. But the bigger strategy, seems to me, stories of waste, fraud, and abuse from these projects will be legion. That seems to be the more practical hope from the right. Nate Silver at 538 in talking about his view of what's going on in Republican Congress people's heads. Somewhere along the way, they're going to wind up funding a Woodstock museum or a bridge to nowhere. Somewhere along the way, an enterprising contractor is going to embezzle a bunch of stimulus money or cook up some kind of pay-to-play scheme. maybe if you're really lucky, this will happen in your district. Better to keep the whole thing at arm's length and make sure the Democrats will get the blame for that. I think it's not unreasonable to predict that in something this large, something will go wrong somewhere. We're human beings.
Billy, still there?
We're human beings. We're imperfect people, and an 800 billion plus package will have some bad apple somewhere.
You're out near Boston, aren't you?
I am near Boston. I'm 2 hours from Boston, and a lot of people aren't happy with the Big Dig.
Exactly.
I'm not arguing for the Big Dig. The Big Dig would, if something suddenly had the reputation of a Big Dig.
Exactly, the Big Dig times 1,000.
If we had a Big Dig times 1,000, then sure. Well, I'll caveat that by, I think as a general rule, people will tolerate a fair amount of corruption if things are going well for them personally. If the economy is going gangbusters by 2010, corruption arguments are going to get you very far.
But let's go ahead and bet that it's not, and then there's 1,000 Big Digs on top of that.
Then that's your golden opportunity to say, active government is inherent disaster, and the progressive opportunity window will have been missed probably for a generation. That's your best bet. And where I think there is some bit of an endgame on the conservative side is, I think the general consensus is that speed is necessary right now. There is an urgency to getting part of this package in the pipeline, the shovel-ready projects up and running to mitigate the current recession as best as possible. There's long-term things that need to be done that are going to encompass a good chunk of a package of this size. We want as much short-term stuff done as soon as possible. If you can delay and get this thing passed, by March instead of January, you make it all that much harder for people to feel any short-term benefits to mitigate the pain of 2009, which is 2009 pain is inevitable at this point. If you can do that, and then you can cherry-pick out a couple of bad examples out of an extremely large package, then maybe you have some political juice to work with. And that's why I wrote a blog post myself at ourfuture.org and Huffington Post trying to light a fire under the left, because I don't think the liberal blogosphere, there's some blogging on, of course, but it's not nearly the level of intensity and coordination as there was with, say, the flap over Rick Warren's invocation.
Well, let me ask you this. McConnell and Boehner had McConnell had a press conference, and Boehner just released a statement. But Boehner's statement called for Obama and the Democratic leadership to promise to post a full copy of the stimulus bill on the internet and have it readable and accessible for a full week before there are any votes. That seems to be the kind of open and transparency thing that I know Heritage would agree with. We could get the Sunlight Foundation on board, and hopefully even you guys over at CAF and Open Left who are interested in transparency to get on board with that type of request.
Well, I think people would be open to that. D-Day, he blogged recently, I have no problem with the 72-hour rule between drafting a bill and voting on it. But I am touched by the newfound conservative congressional Republicans about fraud and waste. They took an 8-year break from caring about this and allowed giant bricks of money to be given away in Iraq, and a government concerned far more with profit-taking and fulfilling its regulatory mission. But they can be forgiven for this temporary lack of attention to the destination of taxpayer money. After all, it is a new year coming up and changes in the air. I don't have a problem with it myself. I do think, and we've seen some of this already, an attempt to take a line item out of, say, I blogged about this before, U.S. Conference of Mayors had their wish list out. This is what they said they thought was shovel-ready. These are our ready-to-go projects.
Which we talked about before.
We did. National Taxpayers Union had a hissy fit about all zoos and museums and bike paths and a water park ride in Miami.
Hey, man, we threw a hissy fit, too.
Sorry, I didn't mean to slight Heritage Foundation there. But when CNN, carried NTU's water on this and did a very hysterical report about it, there are $300 million of pork in this. Well, it's a $73 billion package, so that's 0.5% of what you're complaining about. So I don't mind putting it up there, letting people look at it, but I would also urge people to look at it in context and actually realize that the vast majority of you can pluck out things and make them look silly without actually exploring the merits of the project. And two, the vast majority of this is almost surely going to be things of not just merit, but of necessity if we're actually going to strengthen our energy system, strengthen our roads and bridges, strengthen our rail, I got to say one thing here. Michelle Malkin's post on high-speed rail that you sent to me.
Oh, yes. Well, I wanted to talk about it, but you go first.
Oh, this is so illuminating to how conservatives are approaching this debate.
Well, I do try to illuminate you, Bill.
So, Michelle Malkin, so she's talking about the plan. California is moving ahead on high-speed rail, which would connect L.A. to San Francisco. So Michelle writes...
Depends what you mean by moving ahead, because California's broke.
Well, they passed the ballot initiative to actually raise the money to move on the project. And I should say, 10 years ago, I actually did some work for the California High-Speed Rail Authority, and there was an attempt to get that ballot measure done 10 years ago, and California flinched on doing it. And, if we had done it back then, they would actually be in place by now, and it would be a whole world of difference. So Michelle writes, where to begin? It currently costs $49 one way to fly southwest from Oakland to Los Angeles. That flight takes about an hour and 15 minutes. How much will it cost to ride the high-speed rail line from O-Town to L.A.? For comparison's sake, government-funded Amtrak trips from Washington to New York's Penn Station cost about $133 one way on the Joe Biden-endorsed Acela if they're running. That trip takes about 2 hours and 45 minutes. So here's Michelle. I think she's making this perfect, damning argument about how silly and crazy high-speed rail is. Never mind that high-speed rail works fantastically well in several European countries and Japan. So here's what she leaves out of that example. If you have high-speed rail from LA to San Francisco, number one, LA to San Francisco is the heaviest, at least it was 10 years ago, maybe things have changed now, but 10 years ago, it was the heaviest traveled air corridor in the world. And so constantly racked with delays, and that just gums up your ability to travel up and down the state, but since these are international airports, it gums up travel all over the world. So you need to have some other transportation alternative there.
Or you could just build more runways.
What's that?
Or you could just build more runways.
Have you ever seen the San Francisco airport? It's not going to be that. Wouldn't be that simple to do.
There are more airports in the Bay Area than there's San Jose. There's Oakland. You can even go out to Stockton or Fresno.
I'm aware of the Bay. You're aware of the Bay Area. I'm aware of the Bay Area. I think airport expansion there would be a little complicated. Not to mention, there's a lot of global warming issues involving air travel. If you can have non-fossil fuel based transport systems, that's a benefit in and of itself. And I know you believe in global warming because you told me. So, secondly, she says $49 to L.A. to Oakland, hour 15 minutes. What she leaves out of that is travel time to the airport and the security check you need to go through the airport, which adds a new... You have to go to the airport 2 hours early.
No, an hour early.
What's that?
Oh, an hour early.
A lot of places you still have to go 2 hours nowadays because of all the security check through. If you're doing high speed rail, you're going downtown to downtown. You were stepping off the train and you're there. There's no travel time to get to the airport or from the airport. So it's a totally different calculation, and not to mention there's costs getting to and from the airport. So she's inherently making an extremely disingenuous, non-apples-to-apples comparison, which only says to me she is not seriously, and she is a person, but I think conservatives in general, are not seriously engaging in these debates. They're not actually interested in finding the right solution to our infrastructure problems. They're just looking to, throw crap against the wall and hope something sticks, and hope that we actually don't have a full spotlight on all the details of these issues to actually make informed decisions.
Well, I'm all for being there more, full hatching of details on the issues. And, you're right that there would be two different things, but, they are comparable because there are, two different modes of transport to getting down there. I mean, there's also existing freight rail to get down there because a lot of stuff gets there. And a lot of the traffic is freight also, but people can also fly the plane, and it's not the exact same, but it is somewhat comparable, and so there are cost-benefit analysis to make. And you left out the end of her post, where she writes, the bureaucrats say it'll cost $30 billion plus $12 billion for every extension, which means you should triple the asking price. There's no need to guess whether this thing will be a money pit. Just look at the Los Angeles Metro black hole.
Well, the logic, I haven't followed it as closely lately, but 10 years ago the logic was, and this is why we have airports, by the way, private companies generally don't have the financial incentive to invest in the initial infrastructure. Airlines don't build airports. Governments build airports. In this case, the government was going to have to build the rail system because a private company would not put the upfront capital into doing that because it's expensive and there's a lot of financial risk involved. So you're subsidizing the initial infrastructure. At the time, they were talking about having a private company actually run the rail system once it was up and running. I don't know if that's still what they're planning to do. But it's not necessarily going to be all that upfront cost is going to be funneled into the price of a ticket, making a ticket completely economically unreasonable for a train rider. Obviously, if it's not going to be an affordable ticket, no one's going to use it. People have thought about these challenges. It's not like Michelle all of a sudden came up with a criticism that no one ever thought about before. There's a reason why high-speed rail works in France and in Germany and in Japan. They address these issues and everything works very well. So it's hard to make the argument that this is somehow an impossible thing to do.
Yeah, well, it's obviously not an impossible thing to do. It's the question is how much over the cost and what are the other alternatives and are they more cost effective?
I mean, that's a perfectly appropriate debate to have.
And I think that's the one she's having, although in blog post
she's
form
not
and
having,
trying to
she's
score
not having an
parts
honest
of
discussion
points.
about that. She's making a lot of disingenuous arguments to avoid having an actual cost-benefit debate on the merits.
I don't think it's disingenuous. She's saying this thing's going to be a money pit and it's not worth it. She's saying all the projected estimates you're getting from the California government about how much these thing is going to cost is complete fantasy guesswork, and it's going to be a massive big dig disaster.
You don't think the California High-Speed Rail Authority knows what their estimated ticket price is going to be at the end of this? Of course they do. Did she bother to find out?
Of course they have an idea of what their estimated ticket price is going to be. But see, that's again the fundamental difference between Republicans and conservatives, that Democrats and liberals believe plain experts can get into a room and have all the necessary information inputs to tell you what that ticket price is going to be 10 years, 15 years down the line when this project gets finished. And conservatives say, no, there's no way that the estimate is anywhere near the truth.
Well, if Michelle can't even do a honest apples-to-apples comparison about the time it's going to take to go from one city to another, I don't trust her ability to look at the data that a government agency would potentially give her. I mean, obviously, it's going to be public information. I mean, they've been studying this for 10 years in California, and I was there when they were doing all these public hearings addressing all these issues back then. They're not going to just pull a number out of the air. There's going to be a reason for the numbers they come up with.
They're going to pull numbers out of the air. They're going to pull the numbers out of the air that support the policy that they were created.
That's a completely knee-jerk assumption on your part.
The government entity you're talking about was created for the specific purpose of making this policy come to life. Why on God's green earth would it produce numbers that went against its very reason for existing?
Well, keep in mind, this is California High-Speed Rail Authority, as I said, they flinched from doing this 10 years ago. They didn't just go balls to the wall. Who cares what the economic damage is going to be? We're just going to do this, hell or high water. They made it. They pulled themselves back. Actually, they were wrong in doing it, but that's what they did. I think it's a fair point that they obviously have an interest in having this work. You wouldn't set up the agency unless you wanted to accomplish it. But you can look at what they give to you and assess the quality of their work and then make a judgment. Not just assume, by definition, anything they put out is inherently going to be flawed. I didn't see you saying that everything the Bush administration put out is everything the Bush administration said about Iraq is inherently flawed because they really want to go into Iraq. No one made that argument back then. So look at the quality of what they put out and make the judgment on that.
Fair enough. Do you want to move on to unions?
Sure.
You had an Ezra Klein post you want to talk about?
Yeah, well, there's definitely been a lot after the auto rescue plan. After the beating in public opinion, I think that the UAW took throughout this whole spectacle, there's been, and at the same time, a sense that Obama is going to be a more ally of unionization than George Bush was. So there's sort of these competing pressures. So there's been a lot more talk in the media about where the union movement goes from here. And keying off a New York Times story on that, Ezra Klein said, I'll only add that the last great leap forward for unions was during World War II, and the last great expansion of the American middle class followed in its aftermath. In contrast, the most recent expansions, which have largely occurred in the absence of unions, have benefited America's rich. Unions do not change economic growth, or at least as little convincing evidence that they do. The country is the world's highest growth rate, the Nordic economy. It's also some of the world's highest rates of unionization. Denmark, Sweden, and Finland all approach 80%. Rather, unions change the distribution of economic growth. They direct more of it to the middle class and less of it to the executive class. The past few years have been an economy driven by the executive class. The question is whether that's what we want the next expansion to look like also. So I think you're going to see those. I mean, you know full well that the conservative blogosphere and conservative movement is extremely focused on trying to stop the Employee Free Choice Act from getting passed. I find it fascinating how they're prioritizing the issue. But these questions about whether unions are inherently good or inherently bad are gonna kick up at some point over the next few years. And while UAW has been taking on the chin for, I think, getting unfair blame for what's happened with the U.S. auto industry, there's an argument that Ezra Klein can easily make, saying the union membership and union strength is going down over the last 30 years. Has our economy gotten better at the same time? Most people would say no.
Well, now's a particular good data point to make that argument. But, Mickey Kaus, big union lover that he is, responded to Klein's post. He block quoted the section you just read about benefiting the rich, and he writes, "The biggest recent expansion was during the 90s. A, benefited Americans at all levels, but especially average workers, and B, occurred largely while union power was ebbing. The Clintonite formula worked. Maybe it can't be achieved again. Maybe it's flawed because, the rich got richer too under the Clinton years. Maybe a return to Carter-era union power will be better still. But those are arguments Dems like Drum and Klein won't even deign to make, as long as they keep reassuring each other that they not only have the best ideas around, but the only ideas around." Klein also argues that the countries with the world's highest growth rates, the Nordic economies, also have some of the world's highest rates of unionization. Denmark, Sweden, and Finland, all approaching 80%. There's an argument that in countries with 70 to 80, 90% unionization, unions have to be more responsible. Union leaders know that any inflationary wage increases are going to be paid for by their own members, and they know that any declines in productivity will hurt their own members. Not only do they have an incentive to be reasonable, but they have the power to keep their own membership, say those unions that could get bigger than average increases by striking, in check. But we aren't going to get 80% unionization. We're going to get 20 to 25% unionization, or maybe 30, with unions that are powerful enough to cut good deals for themselves, but not so large that they have to take everyone's interest into account. So that's Kaus's more succinct example, but Richard Posner, who blogs at the Becker-Posner blog, Posner's a Sixth Circuit judge in the Court of Appeals, writes more specifically about unions, but a more theoretical example. "The goal of unions is to redistribute wealth from the owners and managers of firms and from workers willing to work for very low wages to the unionized workers and the union's officers. Unions do this by organizing or threatening strikes that impose costs on employers. For employers are rationally willing to avoid these costs at a cost of higher wages and benefits and restrictive work rules. Because the added cost to the employer of a unionized workforce is a marginal cost, unionization results in reduced output by the unionized firm and, in consequence, benefits non-unionized competitors. Unless those competitors are too few or too small to be able to expand output at a cost no higher than the cost of the unionized firms, unionization will gradually drive out the unionized firms out of business. Unions, in other words, are like worker cartels. Workers threaten to withhold their labor unless paid more than a competitive wage, including benefits and work rules. But unless their union is able to organize all the major competitors in the market, the cartel will be eroded by the entry of non-unionized firms, which by virtue of not being unified will have lower labor costs. The parallels to producer cartels exact are workers or producers. We are seeing this process of erosion of labor monopolies at work in the automobile industry. The market share of Detroit automakers has shrunk steadily relative to that of the foreign transplants, and with the number of unionized auto workers, they are fewer by a third or more than they were in the 1970s. If the Detroit automakers will be forced to liquidate unless they can bring their labor costs down to the level of foreign transplants, the UAW will be out of business either because the Detroit automakers liquidate or because as a result of union concessions, the workers will no longer be getting anything in exchange for the dues they pay the union. I don't think there's much to be said on behalf of unions, at least under current economic conditions. The redistribution of wealth they bring is not only fragile, for the reasons just suggested, but also capricious, as it is an accident whether conditions in a particular industry are favorable to unionization or not. So that's a more theoretical reason of why unions are bad for the economy, which, as a long economics guy myself, I agree with wholeheartedly.
Why do you think conservatives care so much about breaking the union movement in this country?
Because
what is
we're
the
for
drive
economic
motivation?
growth, and we think that unions are inherently bad for economic growth.
Now, you just quoted Mickey Kaus,
Yes.
who made an argument that, and I'm not saying I'm in full agreement with everything Mickey Kaus says, of course, that if you had extreme unionization, nearly the entire workforce unionized, that they approach the economy in a better way, and it's very healthy for the economy. So why wouldn't if economic growth was the concern, why not then go everything you could to unionize all sectors of the economy, and so unions would then think more macroeconomically?
Yeah, well, I guess conservatives don't think that workers and unions run companies well, or that they wouldn't. We don't think they run the economy well. We think that
there have been times. There have been. I mean, it's one thing to believe that theoretically, but we can argue that there have been times in America's economy when things have been relatively good, when there was a lot of unionization, and times when it was pretty good when there was a lot of unionization, like in the 90s. I would argue.
I think the only time that it was good with unionization was a very special time in which America was the only manufacturing power in the world, since the rest of the world had just basically been reduced to rubble in a world war.
I don't see why that negates the point.
Because it's the only time because when America had that advantage of being the only manufacturing power in the world. Unions like Detroit were able to get fat off the land. They didn't really have anybody to compete with, so they were able to strike huge deals with Detroit automakers and be rich and share
the
the
unions
growth.
are so evil. They're so detrimental to the economy.
They're not evil. They're no more evil than monopolies or any type of other cartel-like behavior.
Except unions can never fully monopolize a situation like that because there's always going to be management as well. It's a question of achieving some balance. I still understand.
But the UAW does have a monopoly on labor in the Detroit in Detroit auto market.
They don't have a monopoly on the auto market.
No, not on the market, but on labor. Labor is an input to just like steel's an input. There's no monopoly in steel that Detroit has to put up with. They can buy their steel from anywhere. But there is a monopoly they have to put up with labor, and that hurts them competitively.
I'm more concerned.
They can buy their rubber from wherever they want. They can get their capital from different banks. There's no front that Detroit has to deal with a monopoly on, except in the market for labor.
That I'm not interested in getting into a back and forth on this per se, because we can spend all day. It's one thing to hold the opinion,
right?
It's one thing to have the arguments that you have, but when the Chamber of Commerce says it's going to be Armageddon if a bill is passed that simply says the decision whether a workforce unionizes via a card check or a ballot election is in the hands of workers and not in the hands of management. That constitutes an Armageddon moment. That is how deeply and upset and angry, and obviously it seems the conservative blogosphere is very much of the same mindset. It's one thing to say, I don't think unions are a good idea, and I would argue against them. It's something to say, I'm going to just clear the decks and put all of my chips focusing on this, because I think they're so inherently awful. I don't understand the mentality behind the prioritization of the issue.
Yeah, I'm not going to say that, card check's not a top priority. It is, but, we're against it. Other people are I don't think it's anyone, well, maybe the Chamber or and NAM, the National Association of Manufacturers. But, right now stimulus is our priority. Cap and trade's a big priority. Fighting socialized medicine's a big priority. There are lots of other priorities.
Stimulus. Well, take stimulus, for example.
Stimulus also a priority for us fighting.
Right. I mean, stimulus is first. Everyone knows that stimulus is first. That's the January 20th issue. I don't think anyone expects Employee Free Choice Act to come up that early. But you already hear from the conservatives, this is going to pass. What do we do, in lieu of that? There isn't this fire and brimstone. We are going to kill this stimulus package. It is going to destroy the economy. It is big government at its worst.
I think we
can save the republic by defeating this now. There's none of that.
Not for the stimulus, but there is that for both cap and trade and healthcare.
Well, you actually mentioned cap and trade because the ones you brought to my attention I thought were fascinating posts at the corner. This increasing, and forgive me if I'm digressing off of unions.
No, we can switch gears to the climate tax issue.
Al Gore, 2 years ago, made this proposal when he testified to Congress that we should impose a tax on carbon to have a disincentive to pollute the atmosphere with carbon emissions, and make it revenue neutral by correspondingly reducing the payroll tax. And when he said it at the time, he said, "I know this is not in the mainstream political thought right now. I know it's not something you can politically accomplish right away, but I'm putting this on the table for you to chew on and think about it," clearly in the hopes that he's going to take his stature and move the debate in his direction. And now you had on Sunday an op-ed from Arthur Laffer of the Laffer Curve and conservative congressperson Bob Inglis making the exact same proposal, and bloggers at the corner embracing it. I just found that quite stunning.
I found it less stunning. You've seen kind of more movements in that direction. First let's say kind of what it was. Both Lather and Inglis were for a carbon tax, but I think Charles Krauthammer wants a higher gas tax instead, and I think that was Goldberg and Pernod also were kind of more in the gas tax as opposed to the carbon tax mode. And Jonathan Adler also had right in the corner for it. And I think when you put it in terms of a payroll tax, it does have some added benefits to try to get conservatives on board. But ultimately, I think specifically Adler is just overlooking too many other things to ever make the deal worthwhile for conservatives. Adler writes, conservatives, even those vehemently opposed to greenhouse gas control, should like the deal because it is substantially better than the status quo. As a consequence of Massachusetts versus EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency would be required to regulate greenhouse gases. He goes on, advocates of cap-and-trade system should also support this proposal. Some like to think that the Obama administration can enact a cap-and-trade system under the Clean Air Act through administrative fiat. This is sheer fantasy. The Clean Air Act is not that flexible. And any idea to the contrary should have been dashed when the U.S. Court of Appeals invalidated the Bush administration's effort to create a regional cap-and-trade regime for other pollutants. The most prominent cap-and-trade program, that for acid rain precursors, was enacted by Congress. Legislative change will also be required for an equivalent of the GHG control regime. And so my response to Adler would be, Adler thinks you can get this carbon tax, and that will automatically get rid of a legislative cap and trade scheme, or also possibly all the stuff the EPA is planning to put out on carbon regulations. And I just don't think the left would ever go for that. They have too much invested in the cap and trade plan itself, as well as letting the EPA go hog wild on regulating carbon through the Clean Air Act.
Well, there's a fair amount of debate about the best approach on global warming, and the argument for cap and trade that involves an auctioning of all the permits, the pollution permits. So basically, the cap and trade is you have a cap on the number of how much carbon you can pollute in the air in a given year that gradually declines over time. You issue permits that are equivalent to the limit. And under the auction variation of that plan, you sell those permits. So polluters have to pay for the right to pollute, whereas now they get to pollute the sky for free. And those that do a better job cutting down their pollution will have extra permits that they can then sell and trade them with others who are having a harder time with it. So it allows for certain flexibility in the system. Proponents who there are carbon tax folks who don't like that because they think it allows corporations to game the system. Those who support it with the auction will say this is equivalent to a carbon tax because it accomplishes the same function. You are making polluters pay to pollute public sky.
But you're still talking cap and trade, and let me tell you briefly.
Well, my only argument to you is that I don't think you seem to have this there's this notion on the right that regardless of whether you believe global warming is happening or not, that the left's objective in all of this is they don't really care about global warming. They just want an excuse to have more government control over the economy, and that's what cap and trade's going to do. But I think there is an argument that what's good about the carbon tax, putting a price on carbon, doesn't achieve the certainty of having an actual amount capped with the permits. But there's some that argue that
cap and trade.
There's some environmentalists that argue that the carbon tax will be sufficient in and of itself, that price point will get the job done. So I wouldn't be so dismissive that the left will totally. I mean, this is Gore's argument, mind you. It's Gore who came up with this whole thing to have a carbon tax commensurate with the reduction of the payroll tax. So you have a chance of actually getting the left to come on board with this proposal, because you may not believe it, but there are a lot of liberals who actually care about global warming and don't want it to happen. And if there's an argument to be made that this will solve that problem, liberals will gladly embrace it.
Well, let me just read a post by Ian Murray, and then I'll have some closing thoughts because we're over an hour here. Ian Murray writes to the corner, Ramesh, I can't speak to the national security costs of oil except to say that I suspect they generally may be overestimated. But when it comes to climate change, the best research suggests that the tax should be at most about 22 cents per gallon, and probably lower than that. Anything more would be punitive and inefficient. It should also replace all federal fuel economy standards. I might be willing to put up with that exchange, and Detroit would find itself in significant relief, but the enviros just wouldn't stand for it, which shows you exactly how much respect they have for real economic analysis. And I guess my point would be, I think you could get a certain amount of conservatives signing on to a narrow gas tax in exchange for a revenue payroll tax. However, you're not going to see them sign on for a larger carbon tax for the same reason you're never see conservatives sign on for massive cap and trade tax. It's because any type of carbon tax or cap and trade will necessarily involve a huge new amount of government regulation and monitoring of every sector of the economy.
You got to monitor.
Right.
I mean, how do you know how much carbon you're taxing if you're not monitoring?
Exactly. And that is what the conservatives will always be against.
Why are the conservatives promoting it? What do those who are promoting it right now, Laffer and Inglis, how do they think it's going to work?
I think there are some. I don't know if they think. I don't know if they thought through how it's going to work. What I'm saying is that you could see something attaching just to a gas tax, because that's a tax that we already have. People we already have it. It's already implemented. We already can monitor how much people buy in gas and tax it right there. So you're not going to have all the slippage and corruption and losses that you're going to have in any type of cap and trade set. You're not going to have a new massive government bureaucracy needed to monitor every sector of the economy with a gas tax.
Well, remember, if the issue is global warming, and global warming is about carbon emissions, I mean, it's not just taxing things for taxing things' sake. Sure, I mean, there's arguments to be made for a gas tax, but that's a piece of the global warming puzzle. Carbon is the nut of it. So
I think you're touching.
Hey,
you're touching.
I'll be for a gas tax increase, but it's not necessarily solving the global warming problem.
I think you're touching why, which is why I don't think this is ever going to get done, is because there's just too narrow a common ground here for what the right would be giving up, which is or raising the gas tax, which is what the left have to be up, would mean all the rest of their carbon cutting agenda. Is that you're just not going to have a common ground on conservatives. Allowing for the massive regulatory scheme that would take to institute an all-out carbon tax, as opposed to a very narrow and doable gasoline tax.
Well, then, if that's the case, because Obama's for cap and trade with auction, that's what he said, and I think there's a fair amount of momentum towards that. So if there isn't going to be a grand bargain between Al Gore and Arthur Laffer, then yes, we're probably talking about a cap and trade system. I would bet, within the next 2 years, but we will see. We've spent a lot of time, but one of these days I do want to talk about. I'm constantly fascinated by the caricatures the right has of the left.
Okay.
And submitted as environmentalists won't do X, as if it's that monolithic a group, but it has these sort of
but I think you just admitted that you wouldn't give up the whole idea of cap and trade and the Clean Air Act being able to monitor and regulate all greenhouse gases in exchange for just a narrow gas tax, right?
Well, it's understanding what the principles are. There's a principle that environmentalists share, that climate change is a imminent and urgent problem, and so the solutions have to solve that problem. So, I mean, there are a lot of environmentalists who are for a gas tax, but it's not a holistic solution to that problem. So that's the underlying basis. Whereas I think a lot of conservatives look at environmentalists as silly people that don't understand the economy and just like to do symbolic things for the sake of doing them, or the whole environmentalist thing is a total ruse. It's all about control and regulations, rules for no end.
Well, Lieberman Warner is entirely symbolic. Even if it passed and worked 100%, it would still wouldn't reduce any.
But calling it symbolic, I think, is very inaccurate.
It still would not reduce global temperatures in any meaningful way. It wouldn't prevent any of the harms that all the
there are
environmentalists
that believe that Lieberman Warner was insufficient to the goal, that the targets were not strong enough.
So in that sense,
there wasn't a strong environmental push forward. It's one of the reasons why it barely got out of the box.
I have a sinking feeling we're going to be having this fight again sometime.
I'm sure of the policy fight,
okay.
But I hope there are discussions, Conn. I try not to paint too broad a brush of the right. I hope
except for calling us all racists, right?
Did I say that? I don't think I did. I find it bizarre when everyone's defending a racist song. It's not the same as calling you all racist. But I hope that I serve some benefit of not having the left caricatured completely as well.
And I'm glad I was able to illuminate you twice this week.
Good to talk to you as always.
See you in the new year.